Hello and welcome to the Buddhist Studies podcast. I'm your host, Kate Hartman, Assistant Professor of Buddhist Studies at the University of Wyoming and Director of Buddhist Studies Online. We're here today with Dr. J. Garfield, who is Doris Silbert Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy, Logic, and Buddhist Studies at Smith College. He's also the Chair of the Philosophy Department at Smith and Visiting Professor of Buddhist Philosophy at Harvard Divinity School, Professor of Philosophy at Melbourne University, and Adjunct Professor of Philosophy at the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies, as well as many other appointments and activities. Dr. Garfield's research addresses topics in the foundation of cognitive science and the philosophy of mind, metaphysics, the history of modern Indian philosophy, topics in ethics, epistemology, and the philosophy of logic, the philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment, methodology in cross-cultural interpretation, as well as topics in Buddhist philosophy, particularly Indo-Tibetan Madhyamaka and Yogacara. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Dr. Garfield.
It's a total pleasure, Kate.
Well, why don't we get started by learning a little bit more about you? How is it that you ended up studying Buddhist philosophy?
Well, that's a long story, but I'm going to give you an abbreviated version of it. And it's a sort of accidental story. My training was in philosophy, which especially when I was a graduate student and an undergraduate, really meant European philosophy. And of course, as you probably know, that's still a problem in philosophy departments around the world. Thankfully, it's getting a little bit better, but only incrementally so. But the bottom line is that I finished my PhD, like many people of my generation, not even knowing that there was such a thing as non-Western philosophy. That's just a fact. So in my first teaching job out of graduate school, where I studied logic and cognitive science, I was teaching at Hampshire College in Western Massachusetts. And the very first student who came into my office when I was just beginning my teaching career and literally unpacking my books and putting them on the shelves in my very first grown-up office, asked me to chair his senior thesis on connections between the social contract tradition and medieval Tibetan epistemology. And when he proposed that, I burst out laughing. I thought somebody had paid him a bunch of money to give me a welcome to Hampshire joke. And he was a little bit offended because he'd been studying Tibetan so that he could work on this project, and he'd been working on his French to do Rousseau. And here was this brand new assistant professor just laughing in his face. We kind of got past that. He said, hey, listen, this guy, Bob Thurman up the road, because Bob was then teaching at Amherst College, and I was at Hampshire, and they're in the same consortium. He said, Bob, he'll keep me honest on the Tibetan philosophy. I just want you to do Locke and Rousseau with me. He said, you can read Locke and Rousseau, can't you? And I said, sure, I could read Locke and Rousseau. And I thought it was a bad idea to start turning students down on my first day in my career. So I agreed to do it. And the result was, of course, that I had to read the stuff that he was reading and to read the stuff he was writing. And so my introduction to Buddhism and to Buddhist philosophy was reading the rough drafts of Bob Thurman's translation of Tsongkhapa's Essence of Hermeneutics, Lecce Nyingpo. And some of your listeners will know, but not all of them, that is an extraordinarily complicated text that is examining hermeneutic practice and the interpretation of the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, and how we distinguish between texts that are definitive in meaning and texts that require interpretation, and what constitutes a good interpretation. That basically presupposes that you've got a very, very thorough background in Buddhist philosophy. And this was one of the earliest attempts to translate a Tibetan scholastic text. This was a long time ago now. And I was reading rough drafts of this extremely advanced Tibetan text on hermeneutics, and I was totally baffled. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I didn't recognize the references. I couldn't figure out why these issues were being brought up. But, I worked on it for a while with David and with Bob Thurman, and by the end of the year, I realized that this was a move in a very profound philosophical tradition. Unfortunately, I was a beginning assistant professor, and I had a career to get going, and I had to, be working in logic and cognitive science. And so I kind of put that aside after that for quite a long time, knowing that it was there, but, you know, not being very interested. Well, not that I wasn't interested, but not having time to work on it. But then about 7 years later, there was a big battle at Hampshire when I was there. And it was a battle over a new academic requirement, which Hampshire in its, you know, kind of politically overheated way calls the third world expectation, but is really a very strong multicultural requirement. And it's a requirement that every student, no matter what he or she are studying, study the way that that discipline is pursued in some non-Western culture or its impact on some non-Western culture. And that's true whether you're studying art history or photography or physics or philosophy. And of course, it turns out you can't require students to study things that you don't teach. And so it became a requirement on faculty members to basically retool so that we could satisfy the third world expectation from our side of the desk or leave. And I kind of panicked because I didn't know any non-Western philosophy, but then I said, aha, medieval Tibetan epistemology. I could learn enough of that by hiring Bob to teach me in the summer to do a week in my epistemology course, and I will have paid my debt to the third world expectation. So I applied for a faculty development grant, and I got enough money to hire Bob to teach me some stuff during the summer. And I slotted it into my epistemology course, and the students loved it, and I found it really interesting. So the next year I applied for a bigger grant to develop a full-blown comparative epistemology course, and that was just a lot more fun. And by this time I was having this problem. You know, I'd be reading a text in English and it would cite something, right? So I remember, you know, reading Tsongkhapa and he's citing Bodhicaryāvatāra. So I'd call up Bob Thurman and I'd say, hey, Bob, do you have a copy of this text called the Bodhicaryāvatāra? And he'd say, sure, I do, Jay, but it's only in Tibetan. I'd say, damn. I'd say, hey, Bob, do you have this text called the Blaze of Reasoning? Sure, I do, but I'm sorry, it's only in Tibetan. So I realized I had to start learning Tibetan if I was going to go anywhere in this. And I also knew that I needed to learn a lot more Buddhist philosophy than I knew. So there was this great University of Hawaii NEH summer seminar coming up, Hawaii, on Nagarjuna and Buddhist thought. And I was really kind of interested in Nagarjuna by this point. So I thought, well, I'll never get into this, but what the hell, I'll apply. I applied and I got in. And I spent 6 weeks in Hawaii studying Nagarjuna, and it was just so much fun. Between the beaches and the text, it was just an almost unbeatable summer. And I had a sabbatical coming up. And so I was starting to ask people, if you're actually serious about Buddhist philosophy and you want to get your Tibetan together, where do you go? And everybody said, you go to the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies in India, and that's the real place to go. And if you're lucky, you try to study with Geshe Yeshe Topka. So I applied for an Indo-American fellowship, figured I would never get it. We got it. And so my wife and I packed up our young children, who were then 6 and 10. And in 1990, we went off to India for a year. And I never looked back. That's how I got into Buddhist studies.
That's fantastic. And as an assistant professor myself, I love the idea of following students' interests, and that it really led you someplace that you might not have known to pursue yourself. Can you remember back to those early readings and think about like what was it that really caught your attention, or perhaps made you say, oh, this thing that I didn't know about and didn't think I had to know about was actually something worth pursuing?
Yeah, that's both a really great point and a really great question. And I'm going to underline the point. You know, over 40 years into a teaching career, I've constantly been grateful for the fact that the best thing about teaching is the amount that I learned from my students. And the second best thing about teaching is the joy that one gets in the success of one's students. And so teaching really is a wonderful gift. But you were also asking a question. So I'm remembering sitting up late at night with Lekshen Yingpo, with the Essence of Hermeneutics, saying to my wife, look, these guys are saying both that you can assert a sentence, you can deny it, you can both assert it and deny it, and you can neither assert it nor deny it. And then they're turning around and saying you can't do any of those four things. And what I recognized right away was that the first diamond of assertion, denial, both and neither was the same as the semantics we have in logic for first degree entailment. True, false, both, and neither. And I thought that was just totally cool that somehow somebody had figured out the best semantics for the conditional a few thousand years before we had in the West. But then the real flip was the denial. And that just set me on my heels because I recognized that that was just a natural extension of all of this and one that nobody around here had ever thought about. And so I thought to myself, the real beauty of looking at this other tradition is not that we find ourselves being done maybe earlier by folks who spoke a different language and looked different, but that we not only find ourselves, but we find something we didn't think about. And then when you encounter the doctrine of the two truths and the idea that the two truths themselves are both identical in one important sense and distinct in another important sense, you recognize that you're being taken ontologically in places that we don't go in the West. So what I was really impressed by was the idea not only that philosophy is an extraordinarily global enterprise, but that, like, say, human languages, there's differences depending on what tradition you begin working in. And so at some point, the obvious insight hit me, and I feel embarrassed that it took so long. The insight was that if you're going to study and pursue philosophy and only pay attention to things that white people have written, that's kind of like deciding to, I don't know, study music, but only listen to things that were composed on a Monday. And that there's something horribly arbitrary about the Eurocentrism of Western philosophy, as well as something politically unacceptable about Eurocentrism in the wake of colonialism. So that just became a commitment to try to work to globalize philosophy more. But really the first thing that really caught me was that Chatuskoti, that four-cornered logic, and both the resonance and the difference. The resonance with really profound ideas in 20th century Western logic, and then the extension beyond places that Western logicians had gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sense of recognition, but also of something else beyond. And yet, also in encountering this thing that was different than anything you'd encountered previously, it still must have struck a chord of this seems true, right? This does have some resonance, perhaps not with philosophy as it has been mapped out by scholars thus far, but with your experience of reality.
Yeah, I would put it this way. Well, maybe I'd put it a couple of ways. Here's one way to put it. The beauty of engagement with a tradition like the Indian and Tibetan Madhyamaka and Yogacara traditions is that the concerns and the approaches of the philosophers in that tradition and philosophers in the Western tradition are close enough that we can understand each other and talk to each other. And they're different enough that we have something to say to each other. So it's not just an echo chamber, but we're also not in totally alien projects asking entirely incommensurable questions and operating in totally disjoint frameworks. There's enough overlap to make conversation possible and enough difference to make that conversation worthwhile. And I think that's the kind of degree of proximity and distance that you want to have productive conversation. It's no fun talking to yourself all the time or talking to people who agree with you about everything. There's a great Tibetan proverb about that, right? Kepa tu na kepa min. If two scholars agree, there's no scholarship there. So you want to have enough friction to get some sparks going. And I think there definitely is when you put Western and Indo-Tibetan philosophy together, but enough proximity that you can actually rub those sticks together. And there's that as well. And it's just a really wonderful coincidence that happens.
Mm-hmm. Rub those sticks together and actually get some sparks, get some fire going.
Yeah.
It's important. And so this is, a silly question, and so I'm posing it just to have you knock it down, but I imagine it's one that listeners will have heard, and it's one that you probably face all the time in having this mission for cross-cultural philosophy. So what do you say to the, again, person I think we both disagree with, who says, that's well and good that what Buddhists are doing has its own logic, they're certainly thinking some thoughts, but it's not philosophy.
Oh, sure.
Maybe that's religion. And hopefully this question isn't so dumb that you just have refused to answer it at this point. But what do you sort of say to someone who tries to stop you with that question?
Yeah, no, it's actually an important question. And it's a question that can get me into a rage at certain points, but I can also answer it with a certain degree of calm at this stage. Because as a historical fact, most attention to Buddhist philosophy, and for that matter to Chinese philosophy, and to Native American philosophy, and to African philosophy, has been found either in area studies programs or in religion departments, and not in philosophy departments. Because philosophy departments have thought of themselves as, like I like to say, it's sub-departments of the white studies department. And you probably know that Brian Van Norden and I had a very provocative op-ed in the New York Times a few years back about this, where we said, if philosophy wants to stay Eurocentric, they should just call it what it is, call it Western philosophy. And oftentimes when I'm invited to talk to philosophy departments, I raise hackles by thanking people for inviting me to their Department of Western Philosophy. But anyway, so when I began doing this stuff, and when I published my first papers on Nagarjuna, because my anchor in my Buddhist study career has always been Nagarjuna. That's where I started, and that's where I continue to orbit. I had colleagues who literally said, "Oh, have you quit philosophy and joined religious studies? Or are you going to ever do philosophy again, or have you decided just to do religion?" And I just find that bizarre. Of course, if people write about Descartes' attention to proofs for the existence of God, that counts as philosophy. But if you look at Tsongkhapa thinking about logic and hermeneutics, that suddenly counts as religion. If you look at Hume talking about causality, that's philosophy. If Nagarjuna offers the same arguments about causality, that's religion. And that's bullshit, right? Because what that really does is it elides the fact that much of Western philosophy developed in the context of religious programs. You can't understand Descartes without understanding the Catholic background against which he's working. You can't understand Bishop Berkeley without understanding the religious background against which he's working. You can't understand Kant without seeing the Lutheranism that underlies everything Kant is doing. So Western philosophy isn't divorced from religion. We like to think it is because of the Galileo controversy. Because before Galileo, of course, nobody in the West would have thought of distinguishing philosophy and religion. They were the same thing. It was when science and the Catholic Church parted company and philosophers said, we're on the science team, that philosophy became opposed to religion. Now, it's worth remembering that Galileo never existed in India or China or Africa or the pre-invasion North American continent, right? Galileo's a European guy. So philosophy, while it also developed in the context of religious traditions in these other cultures, never had to decide, okay, we're really different from religion, because there wasn't a Galileo controversy to motivate that. It does make sense to look at the Buddhist tradition, to take the example that we're really working in here, as a religious tradition. To pretend that Buddhism isn't a religion is foolish. But to pretend that the philosophy that's developed in the Buddhist tradition isn't philosophy because it's developed in the context of a religious tradition is both to mistake what's happened in the West and to denigrate and to say it can't be as smart as what we're doing. It can't be as rational as what we're doing without reading it. And I must say that I find that the people who refer to, say, Buddhist philosophy as just religion are universally people who have never studied Buddhist philosophy at all, but somehow have studied a philosophical tradition that gives them the clairvoyant power to know that the texts written that they've never read are nonetheless not worth reading. I find that to be deeply disturbing. I have never met any philosopher who has paid attention to Buddhist philosophy, who has not come away with respect for Buddhist philosophy as philosophy. So I kind of know who the people are who talk about this as just religion. And believe me, in philosophy, you cannot call something religion in a non-pejorative way. That's just an institutional phenomenon, right? So it really is a way of deprecating and justifying, ignoring a whole philosophical tradition to say it's not really philosophy. I find that to be deeply distressing. But as I say, nobody who actually reads it says that. It's only the people who have developed the clairvoyant power of knowing without reading it that it has no value for them who can say that, which gives me an enormous respect for Western philosophy, because I'd never realized that it can lead to that kind of clairvoyance before my conversations with these people.
Yeah, just yesterday I was talking with a colleague here at Wyoming and was sort of explaining this, ideas about Buddhist ethics. And, one of the things that I'd love to do here at the university is to get a sort of the ethical reasoning and civics requirement for students. Just, currently we have a non-Western requirement, which again is just defined by not being the thing that is assumed to be normal.
Yeah.
And you would love to expand that, but I gave my sort of pitch about that they wanted it to be sort of ethical theory, in the Western philosophical tradition, totally housed in the philosophy department. And I said, well, no, ethics happens in all of these other places. And I gave my pitch about Buddhist ethics, and they said, oh, so it's virtue ethics. Done. They'd heard, a 5-minute summary. They had slotted it into the category they already had, and now we can move on.
Yeah, you've actually raised two important issues there. I'd like to say something about each one of those, if I might.
Great.
One of those is the idea of the normal and the abnormal, right? And we often hear this kind of rhetoric when we talk about either tolerance or diversity, that we're really interested in things that are different from us because they're exotic and weird, and they allow us to develop more tolerance for people and ideas that are different from us. So we've got the norm, and then we've got things that are different from the norm. I call that the center pole version of the universe, that says we live at the middle pole, not the North Pole or the South Pole, but the center pole. And everything else can be defined by how close it is to normal or how weird it is from in terms of its difference from normality. Now, when we were in India in that year, 1990 to 1991, one of the most valuable moments of that year for our family was when my then 6-year-old said to me after a few months living in this small village in India, and back then, this was before the opening, we only had electricity a couple of hours a day. Our water came from a pump. There were no telephone lines in our town. It was a very, very remote little place back then. Not anymore, but it was then. And he said to me, Dad, I suddenly realized something. More people in the world live this way than the way we live in America. This is what normal is, not the way we live. Bingo. The next moment, of course, of that realization was that there is no normal. There are just ways people live and ways people think. And so one of the really important things to learn from doing cross-cultural philosophy and from globalizing the discipline of philosophy is the idea that there's just regular philosophy and then other stuff is weird, right? So if you call your course on Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics ancient philosophy, watch it. That's ancient Western philosophy. But you haven't talked about ancient Chinese philosophy. You haven't talked about ancient Indian philosophy. That's not ancient philosophy. That's ancient Western philosophy. If you call your course on Descartes, Berkeley, Spinoza, Locke, Leibniz, and Kant early modern philosophy, watch it. That's early modern Western philosophy. The moment we take the West to be the unmarked case in our grammar, we've taken that to be normal and everything else to be deviant. That is simply racist. There's no other way to get around it. When people talk about structural racism, that doesn't mean that people who do this are racists. It means that we've got a structural racism built into academia that treats what European people do as the norm and everything else is a special case that allows us to do Indology or Tibetology, but not Americology or Germology or Britology, right? So that we're able to distinguish between subject cultures and object cultures, normal cultures and marked cultures. And you get a philosophy department that'll have a Kant specialist, a Leibniz specialist, a Locke specialist, an Aristotle specialist, a philosophy of science, meaning Western philosophy of science specialist, a Western ethics specialist, and then maybe one person who does all of non-Western philosophy. Because of course, everything happening in China, India, Africa has got to be exactly the same. And you only need one person to cover the entire world except for the West, and a dozen to cover the West. That's structural racism in academia. And if people don't recognize that, they're not paying attention to what structural racism is. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is this tendency to think that the way that we should approach non-Western traditions is to quickly map them onto something that's already there in the West. Oh, that's just virtue ethics, or that's just consequentialism, or oh, that's just nominalism, right? And say, okay, we don't need to do that because we've already got that in the West. So why do we have to learn a funny language? And then also, listen to people who, look different from us to know what we already know. That's also pernicious. It's pernicious because the set of intellectual categories we've developed might make sense in our tradition and might not make sense there. And by putting people into these pigeonholes, we manage to miss actual diversity. And if we look at Buddhist ethics, for instance, I think that one of the most powerfully important things about the Buddhist ethical tradition is that it doesn't simply replicate either consequentialism, deontology, or virtue ethics, but rather it offers us another alternative way to think about ethics, what I like to call moral phenomenology. And by trying to map it onto a pre-existing Western doxography, what we do is occlude what's distinctive about what we're finding. It would be as though you kind of learned how to recognize elms and oaks and ash, and then you went to Australia and tried to figure out what kind of deciduous tree all those gum trees are. You might say, oh, let's call that one an oak and that one an ash and that one an elm, but you'd be missing everything that's important. And I really do think that one of the things that we learn how to do, that we don't automatically know how to do when we cross cultures, is to step back, to listen, to read, to do what Shantideva calls in chapter 6 of Bodhicaryāvatāra, be like a block of wood. Don't react immediately. Don't say, oh, that's just consequentialism. Say, wait a minute, maybe I should read the book before I decide what it's saying. Maybe I should read some literature on it before I decide that I know what it means. And that kind of respectful engagement that says that I've got something to learn rather than an instant decision to make, because I can make that decision being a European scholar, is that learning that kind of respect and that humility is one of the gifts that we get from cross-cultural philosophy.
And that seems like a great transition to start talking about your upcoming course, BSO 201, Bodhicaryāvatāra, How to Lead an Awakened Life. But before we get there, I'm actually going to ask one more question that I've often heard, in Buddhist Studies online from students in some of our other courses. They'll ask, why is Buddhist philosophy important? Shouldn't I just, maybe sit and meditate, and all of this kind of words and concepts is just getting in the way? What do you say to someone who has that kind of approach?
I say, think again. Very few people have been hurt by learning something and by thinking carefully. That's the big picture. Now here's the smaller picture. The great Chinese Chan master, in fact, one of the real progenitors of the Chan tradition in China, Zongmi, has this beautiful verse in the Zen preface where he says, let my mind be a clear mirror to understand the teachings and to deepen my meditation practice. And let my meditation hone my mind so that I can understand the texts. And Zongmi really gets it, that meditative practice and scholarship are two sides of the same coin. Meditative practice is meant to deepen our insight into the nature of reality. But if you don't know, and you don't know what you're trying to find, then you can confuse a simple blank mind or just some dumb idea that occurs to you in meditation with deep insight. I mean, here's a way to put it. If you're going to be a good meditator, you've got to hone your mind to know what its target is. Your mind is like an instrument. And if you don't know whether your mind is a telescope or a microscope or a kaleidoscope, you don't know whether what it's delivering to you is something you should dismiss as a bunch of pretty colors, or take seriously as a big picture, or take seriously as a minute picture. So I think of philosophical analysis as the preparation for meditation, so that when you're actually trying to get a meditative engagement with reality, you make sure that you're actually engaging with reality and not just with a figment of your imagination. There's a reason that all of these great Buddhist scholars from India, from China, from Tibet, from Korea, from Japan, from Germany, from the United States, have spent so much time developing a systematic account of the nature of reality and defending it and arguing for it. It's not in order to disrupt people's meditative practice. It's meant to inform Buddhist practice so that you actually understand what you're doing. I honestly don't think that a successful meditative practice is possible without philosophical engagement.
And that can be hard to keep in mind in sort of the modern Euro-American context, where there's often this rhetoric that picks up on a rhetoric in Buddhist traditions of non-conceptuality, of immediacy. But it's easy to forget that, folks like Dogen in the Zen tradition both read and wrote a lot of philosophy, and that there's an incredibly, huge and diverse literature where Buddhist thinkers thought that it was important to get it right. One of the exercises I'll talk about with my students, because, I find if you're losing an undergraduate audience, I'll bring up a question of, a psychedelic trip or something like that. And that gets their attention right back. And you say, well, what's the difference between, let's say you take some hallucinogenic drug, you reach some sort of state of dissociation or ego death that seems at least superficially similar to perhaps states reported in meditation. What's the difference there? And, this both gets them back to you and also helps make this important point, which is to say that perhaps many of us know someone who had some sort of insight during, a psychedelic trip, and then tries to report it out, and you're like, that's perhaps not as profound as you think that it is. And that part of what is different about those kinds of experiences is that one is placed into a context of how to reach it, how to understand it, how to integrate it back into a life, and in particular, an ethical life. And so, if we're just focusing on the nature of a certain kind of experience that is, to use perhaps an outdated term, mystical or, transcendent in some way, we're missing that these experiences, at least in a Buddhist context, exist in terms of a broader context, a broader project, a broader understanding of reality.
That's right. Meditation is meant to be transformative. And you want to be transformed in the right way. And you want that transformation not to be a transformation that happens for 30 minutes a day on the meditation cushion, but a transformation that infuses the rest of your life. That's the point. Meditation isn't about what you do on the cushion, it's about the rest of your life. And the only way that can happen is if you can integrate the experiences you have in meditation with your day-to-day understanding and your day-to-day comportment with the world. And that's the task of philosophy, to integrate those things. Otherwise, it really doesn't make much difference. I mean, after all, you could drop a lot of acid and have this great insight that taxis are made out of newspaper. That's just a mistake. That's not an experience. That's not a validated experience. But you could also have a meditative experience. The taxis are made out of newspaper. And you'd better recognize when that's just bullshit versus a serious experience. And philosophy will help you distinguish those. I think that's really, really important.
And the Buddhist meditative traditions are very aware that sometimes things will occur to you, and sometimes they're thought of in terms of demons that can appear to you while you're meditating, or, false impressions or ideas that you get. Our ability to delude ourselves exists even and perhaps especially in certain kinds of states of meditation, if you're not checking it against, philosophical systems, you're not checking it with a community of practice, with your teacher, right?
Right.
Another important part of this process that sometimes can get left out of a modern Euro-American picture of what Buddhism is.
Yeah. Sitting on a cushion and lighting some incense does not make you omniscient. And it doesn't give you immediate direct access to your mind and reality. It would
be nice if it did.
It would be
whenever someone raises this to me, there's a certain person who comments on every Buddhist Studies Online post of, just shut your eyes and meditate and your mind will turn off by itself. And I said, that would be nice. I would love that.
Or not. If your mind turns off completely, we call that death. And remember that a lot of Buddhist meditative practices, especially in the Tibetan tradition, are analytical meditation practices, where you are thinking hard while you're meditating. You're thinking about emptiness, or about the emptiness of a particular object. You're thinking about how you cultivate care for others. You're thinking about how you cultivate friendliness towards others. And these are rich analytical traditions that remind us that there's not a distinction between philosophical analysis and meditation. Meditation is one way to practice philosophy, and philosophy is one way to understand what you're trying to recognize in meditation. That these are really deeply interlocked activities.
Mm-hmm. It would be, one of the sort of great things about studying philosophy in general is that you learn the kind of habits of mind that can lead you to wrong conclusions, and certainly a bias towards, the easy thing is the right thing, right? To think that one can get enlightened without studying anything, without reading anything, or as you said earlier, without learning something, is an attractive idea that we should, I think, be skeptical of for a number of reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so maybe after taking that little detour, I can return back to where you were leading us before, which is talking about Shāntideva's Bodhicaryāvatāra.
Yeah.
And you are teaching a BSO 201, a text study-based course for Buddhist Studies Online about this text. And I'm really excited about it. Part of the reason that I wanted to ask you to do this is that I at Harvard had taken a class on the Bodhicaryāvatāra on Buddhist ethics with you. And I said, it's great that the 15 of us in this class get to learn about it. It's great, if people want to read your forthcoming book, Buddhist Ethics, a Philosophical Exploration. But I wanted more people to have this opportunity to kind of hear you talk about it, to read this text with you, essentially. But so maybe we can start by talking about what this text is for perhaps listeners who have never heard of the Bodhicaryāvatāra.
Sure. And thank you for those kind words, first of all. It is a text that I dearly love, and I have always had this kind of policy of only teaching texts that I like to read. And it's also a text to which I've returned dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And each time I return, I learn not something new, a whole lot new. And sometimes it's just an idea that I get from reading the text or a commentary, but sometimes it's seeing connections between this text and earlier texts in the Indian tradition, or the connections between this text and later texts, especially in the Tibetan tradition. The intertextuality of the Buddhist world is phenomenal. And Bodhicaryāvatāra is a really important link in that intertextual web of texts.
Mm-hmm. So I could also, interrupt you right there to say that part of this class that we took was that we read the Visuddhimagga by Buddhaghosa, an early Pali Theravada Buddhism scholar who writes a similar path text, as they're known, of how to lead this awakened life. And one of the great things about that class was that there was so much in common between these two different books, and we'll talk about that a bit more. And sometimes we can slot into being like, okay, Theravada Buddhism's over here, radical break, then Mahayana's over here, and they have these two different accounts of enlightenment, and therefore they have not much to say to each other.
Yeah, that's a terrible mistake.
Terrible mistake. And so that was part of why. So after your course, Maria Heim is going to teach a course on the Visuddhimagga. And I know as students won't necessarily take both of them, but I do think that there's going to be a conversation happening between those. So when you mention the intertextuality of these traditions, it speaks to me of not just the joy of reading Buddhist texts, but of reading them together and against each other. Because again, it's not that they agree on everything, right? They overlap enough that you can have a conversation, but there's enough different that conversation is worth having.
Yeah.
So I'll stop that interruption and let you continue.
No, that was a very valuable interruption. Thank you for that. That was the right thing to say. So the intertextuality here is just enormous. And I would also, let me plug, Maria's got a great book in the Cambridge Elements series, a very short introduction to Buddhist ethics. There she really juxtaposes Visuddhimagga and Bodhicaryāvatāra in a really productive way. And that book is really nice. So if people want the kind of Cliff's notes to Maria's course and my course, Maria's little book is a really nice one to read, Elements of Buddhist Ethics.
And it's worth saying, I will link in the show notes to this episode, both the New York Times editorial by Dr. Garfield and Dr. Brian Van Norden that was mentioned earlier. I'll also link to Maria Heim's book and anything else that we mentioned. So if you hear us talk about something in this episode and are intrigued, go to our page and scroll down and you'll find a link to it.
That's great. So anyway, Bodhicaryāvatāra. It was written in the 8th century. And that we're pretty sure of, though the exact dates we don't know. And it was written by this mysterious figure called Shantideva, about whom we know nothing except that he's the person we think wrote this book and one other book, namely a student's anthology, which is kind of the reading list that goes with Bodhicaryāvatāra. And there's of course a nice hagiography of Shantideva, but I don't want to pretend that we know much about him at all, though we do know he taught at Nalanda University, which was for hundreds of years the largest and best university in the world. And if you take my course, you'll get to see a beautiful picture of Nalanda University in the background while I'm teaching. So the text itself is a beautifully complex literary text. And it's, again, as a footnote here, it's worth recognizing that while the authorship is attributed to this guy Shantideva, it's not as though he wrote all of that stuff down and then it was done. It's clear that this text evolved over a period of time, maybe a century or so, and successive editors moved things around, added things, and so forth. And that's not unusual for the career of an Indian Buddhist text, or an Indian text in general. We tend to really give pride of place to single authors of texts or teams of authors, excuse me, in the Western literary tradition. And while authorship is ascribed in the Indian tradition, very often it's much more collective than we like to think. There's a whole industry of searching for or texts, for the absolute original. And I tend to dismiss that. I think that's kind of like searching for the rough draft. The text that we have is the Bodhicaryāvatāra. I think of that as the final draft that the tradition produced, whatever the rough draft might have looked like. So that's just a little bit. The text itself is the most systematic presentation of Buddhist ethics in the Mahayana tradition. And that's kind of what makes it so important. And you paired it a moment ago with Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, which I think is the most systematic presentation of ethics in the Theravada tradition. And there's a reason these texts are put together, as well as the fact that, as you pointed out, they're both path texts. Visuddhimagga means the path of purification. As people who take Maria's course, which I encourage you to take, Maria's a dazzling teacher, are going to see that that's a path that's characterized by starting in a state of kind of murkiness and impurity, like muddy water, and purifying the mud and getting to a kind of clarity. And ethics is thought of as a kind of clarifying practice in that text. Shantideva's text is also a path text, but it's more a path of accumulation. It's a path of accumulating various moral perfections and moral skills and ways of seeing. So they're not not antitheses. They're kind of, I think of these texts as two sides of a really kind of gorgeous coin. And if we think about what that coin is about, here's what it's about. It's about the transformation of our ethical vision of the world. A little while ago, we talked about the danger of crowbarring Buddhist ethics into a Western ethical system, deciding, okay, there's basically three options here. There's virtue ethics or archaic ethics, that's from the Aristotelian tradition. There's deontology from the Kantian tradition, or there's consequentialism from the British utilitarian tradition. And they each have variations within them. Of course, even as an account of the Western ethical tradition, we've somehow forgotten about Stoicism and British sentimentalism and a lot of contemporary feminist ethics and a whole lot of other stuff. But Western ethicists like to do that. People think of doxography as this peculiar Indian and Tibetan and Chinese phenomenon. That's bullshit, right? We're as doxographically maniacal as anybody is. We just don't call it that. Anyway, I think that Buddhist ethics doesn't fit into any of those models at all. And that's why it's so important. It suggests to us a different way of thinking ethically. It thinks of the task of ethics as transforming our vision of the world, transforming how we see ourselves, how we see other sentient beings, how we see the moral universe. And what Shantideva is doing is giving us a path for that transformation and for the cultivation of a more salutary ethical vision of the world. It's a text that begins in fear and confusion, just as the Buddhist path begins in fear and confusion, because it's fear that motivates refuge. And it's confusion that is the root pathology that leads to attraction and aversion that generates the entire mass of suffering in cyclic existence. So that's where Shantideva begins. He begins with a picture of our life as a picture conditioned by primal fear and confusion, and gives us a path to clarity and confidence. And it's a path to clarity and confidence that proceeds by cultivating a progressively deeper and more profound ethical vision of the world and way of seeing ourselves and others. The text itself, as you pointed out, it's called Bodhicaryāvatāra. There's a different, it also circulates under the title Bodhisattvacarya-avatara, which give us different translations of the name of the text. It's translated in many different ways into English. The translation I prefer is How to Lead an Awakened Life, because I think of it as a kind of handbook for awakening, and especially for awakening through ethics.
And your description there reminds me of something that has consistently surprised my students when we read this text together, because I also teach a Buddhist ethics class that is largely structured around this and then oriented towards some contemporary ethical issues, namely racism and climate change. That, you know, we spend 10 weeks reading this book chapter by chapter with, you know, other parallel texts, and then think about, okay, well, based on that, what does it mean about how we face up to certain issues that weren't on the radar of Shantideva or the Buddha? But one of the things that students always mention being surprised by is, as you said, the book is quite emotional, right? As you mentioned, the book starts in fear and confusion, and at various points, Shantideva expresses quite strong emotions of where he seems disgusted, or he seems almost angry, or he seems rapturously overjoyed. You know, perhaps that last one might be a bit more expected by certain folks reading a Buddhist text, but my students are always surprised at how almost angsty and emotional that Shantideva comes off. And so what I'm hearing you say is that this is actually part of the text. This is an important part. So maybe if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah. The text in the Western tradition to which it's most often compared on that dimension is Augustine's Confessions. Despite their differences in doctrine, which are dramatic, there's something very, very akin in those two texts. Each of them is deeply personal. Each is written in a first-person singular. And each of them takes affect and the way that our affect, our emotions, connect us to the world and connect us to others and connect us to ourselves very, very seriously. But the other, and so that's there, right? And that's partly literary device, and just partly a message that it's a really good idea to start with where you are, right, with yourself. But there's, I think, something more profound than that. How to Lead an Awakened Life, like the Confessions, is not a kind of user's manual for the human life that you kind of get with your body and your soul or your mind. And then, you open up the user's manual and, you see it printed in various languages and you find the English language version, just the quick start, right? And then you get going. It's not that at all. It's more a coaching by example. You can think of Shantideva as kind of sitting next to you or putting his arm around you and saying, I know how you're feeling. Let me give voice to that. Let me show you where you can go and how you can feel. I've been there. And so there's this, it's not only intensely personal as a first person text. I read Shantideva as giving us also a very second person approach to ethics, really drawing us in and saying, here's where you're going to go, and here's what it's going to feel like, and here's why you're doing this. And I think that that's a really important idea. One of the texts to which I think this is beautifully connected, it's a text that is about 1,000 years later and in Tibet, is Patrul Rinpoche's Essential Jewel of Holy Practice, which is a wonderful 19th century Tibetan riff on Bodhicaryāvatāra. And one of the brilliant things that Patrul Rinpoche does that I really came to appreciate, I have to say, most deeply in the last summer, when I was, again, rereading this text very carefully, preparing to teach it in this course, I suddenly thought, wow, here's something I never noticed, even though I've written about and translated Patrul's text and I've taught this text forever. Patrul is deliberately taking the first person voice in Shantideva and converting it to a second person voice, and effectively pointing out that the way that you want to understand Shantideva is not just talking about himself, but talking directly to you. So I always say when you read Patrul Rinpoche, you feel like he's grabbing you by the lapels and shaking you and shouting in your face. Where Shantideva is sort of like, let me tell you about me. But actually, Shantideva is just giving you a more gentle version of what Patrul is doing. The first person is there in order to facilitate the second person. Just as you know, when you're talking to somebody who's a very close friend or a close colleague or a family member, if you really want to talk to them in the second person, you have to also talk in the first person. You have to be present. And you have to be present and honest about yourself in order to talk to somebody else. Mm-hmm. Bodhicaryāvatāra is a text that wants you to be present with it and wants to be present with you, talking to you in a first person voice that's meant to be second person. And so I think that intimacy that Shantideva achieves is really powerful because it helps us use this text as a guide to our own transformation. It's not just Shantideva's autobiography. It's a, hey, try this on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's neither just a self-facing autobiography, and it's not a list of you should do this, you should do that, you should do this. It exists somewhere in between. And then by talking about himself and his experiences, you are drawn in. And I can speak as a reader of this text. And again, I've read this many times and find something new every time, that sometimes the specificity that he has, there's certain passages where he's talking about what life must have been like as a scholar at Nalanda, and the kind of professional jealousy and the competition among folks, where it just, strikes you as so human, so relatable.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you have to remember, this was a text that was written by a monk for monks in classical India. And so part of our task in reading it is to use it as a glimpse into that life, if we're interested historically in what it was to be a monk scholar at Nalanda University. But the other part is to decontextualize it and say, okay, how do I take this very specific remark about monastic life and turn it into something that's relevant to my life? Or this very specific remark that has to do with a Buddhist cosmology and turn it into something that's relevant to me, who might not, be taken by a universe of infinite rebirths all kinds of realms with ghosts and things like that in it. How might I take this out? And that's an important part of our reading. There's always a delicate dialectic when we're reading a very old text like this between contextualization in order to read and decontextualization in order to learn. And my advice to anybody reading this text is to do both of those things. Read it partly in order to appreciate its context and to see why it's written in that way, but then decontextualize, because none of us reading this text now or attending this course are 8th century Indian monks. And so while it's really cool to know something about 8th century Indian monks, reading a text to become an 8th century Indian monk is a really bad idea. It's like that, old joke of the person who finds the magic lamp and the genie comes out and says, "I'll give you one wish," and says, "I'd love to have the wisdom of Solomon." And somebody, what's that like? He says, "Now I know how to run a Bronze Age kingdom. What good is that doing me?" Right? So we read this text not just to understand its historical context and what it meant then, but to decontextualize it, to lift the ideas out and to use them in self-transformation. And as you were doing in your course, connecting this to racism, there's so much that we can lift from this text. Shantideva is teaching us how to see ourselves and others differently. And that means partly moving from a way in which we see others as alien, as people of whom we should be afraid, as people with whom we're in competition, to seeing others as friends, to seeing others as people for whom we should approach with care, for others not as different, moving as ourselves as normal and them as different, but as locating coordinate spaces in a moral universe. And Shantideva gives us all the resources we need to do that.
And this general point about reading historical literature is an important one. My favorite theorist is Paul Ricoeur, who speaks of a dialectic of distanciation and appropriation, of putting things in their historical context and representing or respecting the differences there. And part of what we're trying to do with Buddhist Studies Online, because our mission is not to teach Buddhism precisely. We're not teaching meditation, that we think that there's many more qualified Buddhist teachers who can do that. But we do want to really engage in this kind of historical study that we think is complementary to audiences' practice, or perhaps they don't have a practice, that's fine too, but that this process of history is itself important for understanding the text. So one of the things that habits of mind that we want to do in a modern Western context is immediately apply things to our own lives. My students often kind of rebel in the beginning part of the semester when I assign these texts that are in difficult languages. We're reading them in English translation, but the translation is more or less clunky, uses language that's unfamiliar, the style can be off-putting. And they're like, well, can we read more, Pema Chodron, or something that's going to speak really directly to me? And there's nothing wrong with reading that stuff, but I do think that there's something valuable in reading these texts that can initially seem so opaque or distant. And part of what you're doing in history is allowing them to exist in their own context, understanding, okay, what's Nalanda like? What was the training like? What was the life of someone like Shantideva like? How was this text read and received in that context that's quite different than our own? And for folks who think that history is dry and boring, they kind of stop at that step, or they've been unfortunately taught by teachers who stop at that step, which just renders these books into dry museum pieces. And you always want to be doing both, of saying, okay, this is what this text might have meant in its own time and place. But then again, what does it mean for us today? What does it mean for that a book like this can speak to issues like climate change that weren't on the radar of the original author? And I think that says something really important about the nature of reading historical texts in general, philosophical texts, but also scriptural texts, because this text was understood to be scripture by many of its later Buddhist readers, not the word of the Buddha, but certainly an important part of the Buddhist tradition. And so hopefully, what we're doing here at Buddhist Studies Online is getting you into that cycle of interpretation of this text. And so, one other question is, so this book has a progression, and you talk about it starting in primal fear and confusion and eventually getting to this state of clarity. Are there important kind of waypoints along the way that you think are important or striking?
And the really cool thing about this, well, not the really cool thing, here's one really cool thing about this text. There's a lot that really hits you right away when you see it, right? There's the first person voice, there's the images of fear and refuge at the beginning, there's, all this stuff. And then there's the beautiful passages on patience in chapter 6, everybody's favorite chapter, and the complex arguments in chapter 8, and then the detailed and difficult analysis in chapter 9. So there's all this stuff that hits you, obviously, and that people remark on when they see it. But as a literary masterpiece, one of the things that gives this text its power is something that's not as obvious when people read it, and that is the multiple structural themes that hold the text together. So one structural theme is this one, fear to confidence and joy. Another structural theme is one that Shantideva tells you about in the very first chapter, moving from aspirational bodhicitta, the spirit of awakening as a kind of aspiration, to engaged bodhicitta, to really bringing that spirit into your everyday life. And the text is structured around a gradual progression to that. The text is also structured around the bodhisattva stages and the 6 perfections in Asanga's version of the bodhisattva stages. So Shantideva is taking us through all of the stages on the Mahayana bodhisattva path and a set of perfections in order. And it's also structured as a Mahayana sadhana, as a religious ritual. And all of the elements of the Mahayana sadhana in order are present in the text as well. And part of the literary genius of this text, as I say, it might not have been a single individual who figured this out. I think this was edited over time, is that all of these structural devices work together to give the text its power. So just as, if you were studying drawing, this is going to sound like a weird analogy, you'd kind of begin by studying anatomy. If you want to draw the human figure, you got to kind of know about bones and muscles and things like that before you can really draw people in their faces. I think to really understand Shantideva's text, you've got to understand that skeleton that's under it. And it's a skeleton that's just multidimensional. And that's kind of what holds this all together as a single narrative. So that's another thing to which I would draw attention. And in the course, I try to really emphasize the way that is working. The other thing, I know
that's the second lecture. In that first module is the structure of the text, sadhana, alambana, and the bodhisattva path. And perhaps all of us have had the experience of being sort of taken for a ride that works when you don't know the sort of mechanics underlying it. But then also going back and looking at the bones that structure this, one, it makes you appreciate what it does more, makes it ever more clear, as though it were ever in any doubt that this is a classic of world literature and not just of philosophy or Buddhism or anything like that. And it just enables you to slow down and look at the pieces of the book, because it's not that long. You could really sit down in an afternoon and go all the way through it. But recognizing these kind of subtleties to it and the governing logic.
I mean, so for me, the analogy was this one. One of the things for which I'm really grateful in going to India is the fact that I love Indian classical music. And when I first started listening to Indian classical music, I just thought it was really gorgeous and I loved it. And I thought, well, this is just a source of immense pleasure. Then when I started learning about raga and learning about how ragas are expounded in a piece, and when I started learning the difference, what an alapa is doing in a piece, and then learning tala, learning rhythm, and then learning how raga and tala fit together. Now, when I listen to Indian classical music, I love it more because I'm hearing more. I'm hearing things that I didn't even know were there when I first listened. Or when you take an art history class and you first go to the museum, there's a lot of pretty pictures. And now you say, wow, now I see what abstract expressionism is doing. Now I see what Cézanne was doing with that empty space. And you're suddenly seeing things that you didn't see before. When you understand the structure of a text like this, you're going to see things in the text, including the way that content is being woven together that you didn't see before. And it makes it more powerful. So it really is worth slowing down and understanding all of the dynamics of the text. Shantideva also uses many gorgeous literary and poetic devices in the text. Sometimes there are very cool alternations of meter that you don't quite see if you're reading it in English necessarily, that are making interesting points. But the other thing that he does is use these very, very graphic images that I think are sometimes just extremely powerful and are metaphors, right? They're very much metaphors. And the thing about a metaphor is you don't want to think of a metaphor as what you say if you don't want to say it explicitly. You want to think of a metaphor as something that's an image that allows you to kind of internalize and contemplate and come back to again and again. So at the beginning of chapter 5, when Shantideva uses the metaphor of wild elephants of the mind causing so much damage, but an elephant that's been trained and tethered by, introspective vigilance and attention can be a really useful thing. You really see that difference between a mind that's causing you harm and a mind that's beneficial to you, and why training is so important. Or when Shantideva advises you, when you're about to react angrily to something, to just be like a block of wood. That metaphor that just says, shut up, sit down, take a deep breath, and think before you hit send. I think it's just really, really important. And there's so many metaphors like that in the text that are just extraordinarily powerful.
Mm-hmm. And then metaphor is, as just to restate what you're saying here, is not meant to summarize or restate, but to be generative.
Yeah.
Once you have that image, one, it shapes the way that you see the world, because now you see the world in terms of that metaphor. And also it keeps suggesting new things, right?
That's right.
The image of these two different kinds of elements or elephants is going to be able to do more for you, or for an audience that may have seen a rutting elephant and experienced the terror that goes along with that. It's going to be more suggestive than a statement that the uncontrolled mind is dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And when Shantideva says, when the thorn of anger is stuck in your heart, you can't find any peace. That is inviting you to think of anger not as this, justifiable attitude towards people, but rather as a pain that you feel very deeply and that you would rather be rid of than act on. And oftentimes, when we think about anger in a contemporary American culture, we think about slogans like, if you aren't angry, you're not paying attention, right? Or the need for anger in order to motivate political action, or something like that, where Shantideva is actually asking you to recognize that anger is a pathology. It's something that hurts, and it's something that damages you, not something to be cultivated, not something to be stirred up. And that little metaphor is just a really powerful one in doing that. There's so much in this text that's rich.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm really excited to give students the opportunity to read to the text quite slowly. So over the course of the 6 modules you go through,
18 lectures,
6 modules, you'll go through, and again, so many of us are in this mode of like, I got to be efficient, even with my perhaps leisure activities. Is I got to read this book as quickly as possible so I can get on to the next one. Pack in as much learning as possible, but really slowing down and identifying specific verses and identifying the kind of ways in which different verses are grouped together. So for instance, you'll find certain groups of verses that enact a certain kind of meditation, or enact a certain kind of argument, or recognizing the ways that these things are working is, as always, just enhanced by slowing down and taking the time.
Now, tragically, with only, a total of 9 hours of lecture, we can't address every verse in this text. It's way too long. And there's some whole sections that we're leaving out or talking about in the bird's eye view. And for that, I apologize. We would need to have at least 3 times that much to really read through the text verse by verse. But what I've tried to do is to select passages that allow us to really get a feel for what Shantideva is doing, and that I'm hoping will allow people who attend the course to then be able to read the parts I don't talk about and see what's going on. I hope, but I've quite frankly selected the ones that I just think are either my favorites or the ones that I think really help us to work our way through the text and to appreciate these structural maps that Shantideva is drawing.
Mm-hmm. As you said previously, if you're not teaching, the texts and verses that you love, what's the point?
Yeah, exactly.
And one of the great things about this text is that you identify 4 great translations of them. We provide these translations for students who sign up to the course. It's available for free online at Lotsawa House. Again, I'll link to these in the show notes. But it makes it really accessible for folks who want to explore more, who want to go back and read again and again.
Yeah, and the great thing is that these are reliable, good translations. They're slightly different from one another, and that's useful because you can begin to see how different people are reading it. But none of these are bad translations. You don't have to feel, oh my God, I don't know what's going on in this text. These are all pretty good.
And sometimes it's even nice to look at multiple translations and just almost compare them to each other. You get a kind of a 3D picture, particularly if you don't have access to the Tibetan or Sanskrit yourself. Just seeing the way that translators are doing it highlights the sort of active interpretation. I was struck by, to harken back to earlier in our conversation, that when you were reading this, Essence of Hermeneutics that Bob Thurman was translating, that he was in the act of translating it, right? Yeah. For so many of the works that you read, or that I read at least, I make the mistake of thinking of it as like a stable text. But to see that as something is in the act of translation or is in the process of translation.
And that's, the whole role of translation in Buddhism, in the history of Buddhism, is a really fascinating one to reflect upon, as well as the role of translation and understanding quite generally. And one thing that you'll notice is that in this course, the translation that I'm using is my own translation. And not because I think it's better than the others, but just because I want to offer the reader the way I read the text. And you don't have to accept it. You just get the way I read the text, and that's how I respond to it. You also get the way that, Allen and Besna Wallace respond to it, the way that Crosby and Skilton respond to it, and so forth. I think that's useful. But here's what I mean by that. Translation has been an integral part of the transmission of Buddhism from the very, very, very beginning. We assume, for instance, that the Buddha himself was talking in a local colloquial dialect, probably from Magadha. But the memories of his discourses, that's already a translation, right? Because they were memorized and repeated, were then written down in Pali, which would not have been the language that he would have been speaking. So already the earliest canon we have is a translation, and probably a double translation. A translation from the Buddha to those who were preserving the memory of these texts, and a translation from their memory into Pali. Then we have texts that are composed in Sanskrit and sometimes Pali translated into Sanskrit. And then when Buddhism moves to Tibet, the most important aspect of that movement is the wholesale translation of the Indian canon into Tibetan by teams of translators organized by the Tibetan court over a period of hundreds of years. When Buddhism was transmitted to China, an enormous engine for that was the translation of Buddhism from Sanskrit into Chinese. And those were very different translation practices. And a lot of what's different about Chinese Buddhism from Tibetan Buddhism can be traced differences in translation practices. Every place Buddhism has gone, it's been translated into a new language. As it's moved west, it's been translated into a plethora of Western languages, including English. So you don't want to think that somehow right now in the 21st century, reading Buddhist texts in translation is a weird, inauthentic thing to do, that you need to be reading them in the original, whatever the hell that means, right? Notice that we can't read the discourses of the Buddha in the original, because we don't even know what that was. So Buddhism has always been about translation, has always embraced translation. And one of the things that translation enables us to do is to reread a text in a new context. And the word that you used a little while ago that I thought was very nice was thinking of a text as stable. Whenever we think of meaning as being just located in a text, and then it was locked there by the author, by Shantideva, or by Chandrakirti, or by the Buddha, and it was left there as an ingredient in a locked box, and that our job as readers is to find the key, to unlock the box, to find the meaning that the author put inside, we have just missed what's going on in reading. Meaning always emerges in an interaction between the author, the text, and the reader. And that is itself an act of translation and an act of interpretation. Just as in Buddhist theories of perception, we say that perception always arises in an interaction between a sensory consciousness, a sense faculty, a sense organ, and an object. So if I'm seeing the pen in front of me on the desk, it's not like the pen is being delivered into my brain. There's an interaction between my visual organ, my eye, my optic nerve, the visual centers of my brain, light, and the pen out there that constitutes my experience of the pen. The same thing happens in reading. The meaning that we achieve is constituted by that complicated interaction. And translation just makes that all really obvious and external. And so don't think of translation as a crutch. Think of translation as what we always do in reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm struck by the sort of resonance here of this, the metaphor of the conversation that we had before, of a philosophical conversation. You can also think of, reading in those ways, that both in this, act of translation, interpretation, conversation, there is sort of a movement there and an interaction, I think, in all of those things that's helpful to keep in mind. As we try to read and interpret and understand meaning and integrate it into our lives. So perhaps this is a bit of a clunky transition, but as we're talking about books and reading and things, you have a number of books that you've recently been reading, and actually more than one that are, soon to be published or recently published. And just in the interest of your time, because I don't want to keep you all day, I know that you recently finished a book entitled Getting Over Ourselves, How to Be a Person Without a Self, to be published in February 2022 out of Princeton University Press.
Yeah.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about this book? It sounds like you just finished writing it, so perhaps it's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that book. That's a very unusual book for me, and it was a very difficult book to write. So listeners to this podcast are probably aware of Evan Thompson's book published last year on Yale University Press called Why I Am Not a Buddhist, which is a very good book and which I commend to people. And there's also a big philosophical forum on that book in the American Philosophical Association newsletter on Asian and Asian American philosophy. So you can see, my response to that and about a dozen other people's responses to that. And then Evan's response to those responses there. Anyway, that's a plug for Evan's book and for that APA newsletter forum. But I was contacted by an editor at Princeton University Press who said, we'd kind of like you to write a reply to that book. And I said, well, I'm not going to write Why I Am a Buddhist, because that's just not a good thing to do. They said, no, we don't want you to do that. We want you to take some aspect of what Evan has done with which you disagree and just write about that. And so one of the chapters in Evan's book, and it's a very good chapter, is called No Self, Not So Fast, where Evan defends the reality of the self against Buddhist arguments for no self. Now, I should back this up by saying that a few years ago, I published a book on Hume's treatise called The Concealed Influence of Custom, Hume's treatise from the Inside Out. And Hume has always been a big touchstone for me in Western philosophy. And Hume argues ferociously against the existence of a self and for the existence of a person in terms very similar to those used by Buddhist scholars, like the possibly mythical Nagasena in the Milinda Panya, The Questions of King Milinda, and Chandrakirti in Introduction to the Middle Way, Madhyamaka-Avatara. And those are arguments that Shantideva imports, by the way, into How to Lead an Awakened Life. And we'll see those developing in chapters 8 and chapter 9 when we get there. Anyway, so thinking about arguments against the existence of the self, both in the West and in the Buddhist tradition, has been a big part of my life. So I decided that's what I'll write about. I will really explain why Evan's wrong about that. Now, it's not specifically a reply to Evan, because I don't say, all right, here's what Thompson says, and here's why it's full of shit. I don't do that. And I have too much respect for Evan to do that. Instead, it's me writing about why there isn't a self, but there is a person, and the advantages of thinking of yourself as a person and not as a self. And it's not about Buddhist accounts of no self. It's not about Western accounts of no self. It's about the problem. And it draws on both Western and Buddhist sources. But the real trick was that, just like Evan's book is addressed not at a professional philosophical audience, but at a general educated audience. It's a trade book, not an academic book. They wanted mine to be like that. And aside from textbooks, I've never written a book that wasn't a serious academic book. And so trying to write this in a way that doesn't dumb it down, but really has the ideas and the details there, but which doesn't require you to be a philosopher to read it, and had to be done in a very short space, because they give you very tight word limits for these, was really hard. So trying to keep the level right and the detail there, but not too hard, but do it really short, made it one of the most difficult books that I've ever written for me to write. But I'm hoping that it's one of the easier ones to read, and we'll have to see. But as I say, it'll be out in the spring. I also did a series of lectures based on that book for the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. And people who are interested in those can also, those are up on their webpage, I believe. And so you can view those. And that way you don't have to bother reading the book. You can hear me talk through the book, which is maybe briefer, I'm not sure. That's at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies.
Yes, and I'll link to that as well. And that had the original title, Losing Yourself, How to Be a Person Without a Self.
That's what I wanted to call the book. I wanted to call it Losing Yourself, but the people at Princeton University Press said, no, it's going to sell better if you call it Getting Over Yourself, and it's their job to do that. So what can I say?
In their infinite wisdom.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, to explain how you got into Buddhist studies, the importance of philosophy in practicing on the Buddhist path, in explaining about the Bodhicaryāvatāra, and then giving us a taste of this new book that I'm personally very excited to read. This is a conversation that students always bring up. I know the students in the Indian Buddhist philosophy course right now, taught by Karen Myers, are talking about the Pudgalavadins, and similarly these questions about self, person. Do you need to have a self or a person to lead the ethical life? And so I'm looking forward to seeing your contribution to this ongoing conversation. Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. It's always nice talking to you, Kate.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of the Buddhist Studies podcast. Chetan